Alright, this is going to be a tutorial on how to create angled geometry in the Source Engine. We're going to be looking at two different methods, one of which is instances, and the other of which is vertex editing. So first, with instances, I've created just like a quick little building here. It is 512 by 384, and with 16 unit thick walls. What I'm going to do here is I have a VMF. I'm just going to save this as B VMF, and then I'm going to load a VMF again. And basically all I've done here is I've just created a duplicate of the VMF. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to create an entity, point entity, and make that a func instance. And I'm just going to call it B. The VMF file name is B. Which means it'll find whatever VMF is in the same folder as A and grab B. So now I have this other building that I can just move around like an entity even though it's brushwork. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to just kind of grab stuff and rotate it, and it all remains on grid because I can go in here and edit instance, and like it's still on grid, but then when you go back out to the larger VMF, you can see that it's rotated and off grid. And off grid is this is where instances become a little hard to use, because if I go to grid size 1 here, you can see like the corner of the building is not on the grid anymore, and that makes it really difficult to like match this back up with any of the other geometry in the map. Because like if I want to make these two things line up, I literally cannot make them line up. Even on grid size 1, like they slightly don't touch. And actually, I can get around this a little bit in this one instance by taking the building and moving it. And this is because in an instance VMF, it has like a origin. So where the blue lines intersect in the 2D views, that's the origin of the VMF. And so that determines sort of where the rotation point is. And so you can see like this here is the rotation point, and it's moved because I moved the whole thing around, and that makes it so that we can in fact line that corner up exactly, but that means everything else is off the grid as well. Like you can see this is ever so slightly off, and then up here like this is ever so slightly off even on grid size 1. And there are some techniques that you can use to like make these match up. I'm going to actually show one right now. Basically, if you ever absolutely need to make instant stuff match up with quote real world stuff, basically what you can do is use the carve tool, which I know you're never supposed to use, but you can use the carve tool and use instance collapsing. So up at the top here of instance collapse selection, and collapsing an instance basically just takes the stuff out of the VM. Well, it doesn't take stuff out of the VMF, but it collapses it. It just puts it into the big map instead of keeping it as an instance. Also take note that this brush that I have now that it's been classed into the map is 633.6 in size. So you can tell that it is not on the grid. Anyways, I can use this to carve, and you can see I've made a hole in the building now, and then I can just move this back into place, and boom, we've got that. And actually we can see that this is on grid, which just happens to do with the fact that this point is on the grid. So this is actually a much nicer cut than you might end up with normally. But like, if I wanted to somehow, if I wanted to like make something in the instance line up with this point here, I basically can't. There's probably a way to like copy that reference geometry in, but it's not going to be on the instances grid. And then you're just back to square one where you're dealing with weird geometry. So I'm going to undo all of that. And now we're going to look at how to create angled stuff using vertex edit. So I'm going to go ahead and basically just recreate this building, but on a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to start by copying the floor brush, and then I'm going to grab the four vertices and then just move them. And what you'll note is that I am making all of the lines diagonal. Actually, I should back up for a second here. So basically, when you want to create angled geometry with vertex edit, you have to deal with slopes. And a slope is basically an angle, but it's not defined by degrees. It's defined by sort of like what is the size of the rectangle that the diagonal is of. I messed that sentence up. But basically, like a 45-degree angle, this is a 1-to-1 slope because this diagonal here is of this square or of this rectangle that is 1 unit by 1 unit. So I can create another one and that'll show a 1-to-2 slope. So now this square, you can see this is a 1-to-2 slope square, and that's because this diagonal here, the rectangle that it occupies, is 1 by 2. And basically just making sure that you use these slopes means that everything is going to stay on grid, and it will also stay at a consistent angle. And you can see if I go down a grid size, then I can shrink it, and the square stays the same angle. And I can shrink it even more, and I can shrink it even more. And this is essentially how you create angled stuff that stays on grid. So I'm going to go back to this example, and now I'm going to create walls that stay on this grid. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of try and compare sort of what I've done here to what I've done here. So when you look at this, you can see at the current grid size, sort of the interior corner is 1 unit in this direction and 1 unit in this direction. When we look at this one over here, I'm going to shrink the grid size 1. If we treat the diagonal as a unit, this corner is at the same position more or less because it goes in 1 unit, in 1 unit. Now I'm going to do a, well, first I'll finish up this room, just so we get the complete room. I don't like to leave things unfinished. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing with a 1-to-2, and I think this will maybe make a bit more sense. I'll also do it from scratch instead of copying the brushwork so that you can kind of better understand what's happening. Okay, so if I want to do this, I'm going to, well, first I'm going to move this up so that it's a wall, but then you can see that basically, like, if I just go up 2 over 1, then it always stays on the grid of the 1-by-2 grid, if that makes sense. So I'll say this is my wall thickness. Now I'm going to make the side wall, and then this will sort of help show how I do the diagonal. Okay, so now when I want to do the diagonal, I actually, now that I've put these 2 walls in, it actually kind of directly shows me where that interior corner is. But what's notable about this is that if we look at this diagonal, the 1 to 2 diagonal as the unit, it's over 1 over 1. And so now I've created that corner. And that is like that angle in there is a 45-degree angle, even though this is a 1 to 2 and this is a 1 to 3, and it's like, oh, that's an awful coincidence there, but like that's how it works, because it's just this is the diagonal of 1 to 2 and then 1 to 2. So that is more or less how you deal with diagonals or angled geometry, and keeping it on grid with vertex edit is you just make your own grid, but you define it using slopes. So I'll actually just like straight up make that grid. Come on. Yeah, so 1 to 2. And I can just use brushwork to sort of illustrate that grid. Actually, I'll just move that over here. Oh, it needs to be half the size. Okay. Okay. So now we have this terrible looking grid. But you can see how that's sort of the diagonal of one square of this grid that we've created just by using 1 by 2 instead of just, the edge of a regular square of the grid. And as long as you keep everything in this building on that grid, then it remains sort of rational, I guess, if that makes sense. So you can see now that this stays on the grid. If I were to do something like this, it's no longer on the grid, and then it becomes a little bit more difficult to deal with. But if you keep it on the grid that you've created, then it becomes a lot easier to deal with. So hopefully that should give you a good idea of how vertex edit works in relation to making angle geometry that sort of stays on its own grid. It's not going to come to you immediately. This stuff is pretty difficult to work with, but that should give you a good starting point to figuring out how this stuff works.